Rich man insults a waitress in public, and seconds later, he's begging her forgiveness. The restaurant was packed, the sound of clinking silverware and low murmurs of conversation filling the air. Mark Whitmore, a towering figure of wealth and influence, sat ahead of a large, polished table, his perfectly tailored suit catching the light as he surveyed the room. His demeanor was commanding, and the people around him seemed to bend their words and actions to match his expectations. Amidst the luxurious surroundings, Sarah Adams stood at the back, carefully balancing a tray of glasses and scanning the room. She was a waitress at the exclusive eatery, a small job she took to make ends meet as she worked toward her college degree. Her uniform was crisp, but it was clear she didn't belong to the world of lavish dinners and high-end clientele. Still, she carried herself with quiet dignity, never letting her humble circumstances show on her face. Mark, meanwhile, was oblivious to anything but his own presence. He had just closed a lucrative deal over the phone, and his mood was as sharp and flawless as the suit he wore. But his happiness was short-lived as Sarah approached the table to deliver a fresh round of drinks. The moment she set down the glass, Mark's irritation flared. He hadn't even looked at her face yet, his focus fixed on the drink as if it had betrayed him. "Is this what you call service?" he snapped, his voice harsh, catching the attention of nearby tables. Sarah froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had been working here for a year, and she knew well the types of people who frequented this restaurant. But Mark's tone cut deeper than usual. "I'm sorry, sir," she asked, trying to keep her composure. "The glass," Mark continued, his voice rising. "It's smudged. Didn't you check it before bringing it over? Are you this incompetent with everything you do?" A few heads turned in their direction, and Sarah felt a flush of heat spread across her face. She had seen customers complain about small things before, but this was different. The disdain in his voice wasn't just about a smudge. It was about something far more personal. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir," she said, keeping her voice steady. She reached to take the glass back, but Mark's hand shot out, stopping her. No. You'll stand there like the mistake you are and listen," Mark spat, his voice cutting through the air. "I work hard for my money, and people like you are nothing but obstacles. I'm paying for this meal, and I expect more than this." He waved his hand dismissively, as if she were an insignificant speck. "Just get it right next time." Sarah's throat tightened as the sting of his words hit her. She could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, the heat of embarrassment burning her skin. She wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but she knew better. This wasn't the first time she'd been humiliated by a customer. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Of course," she said softly, her words calm but her hands trembling as she took the glass back from the table. She turned and walked away, keeping her head high despite the rush of emotions inside her. Back at the service station, Sarah set the glass down with a heavy sigh. She had been through moments like this before, but each one left a bruise on her spirit. As she wiped the counter down with a rag, her mind wandered to her son, Timmy, waiting at home for her. He was the reason she pushed through this, why she kept showing up, no matter how degrading the work became. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Sarah quickly pulled it out. A message from Timmy's school popped up, letting her know that his upcoming parent-teacher conference was scheduled. She smiled softly. He was the one bright spot in her life, and though her job left her exhausted, knowing he was doing well at school made it worth it. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus, pushing the incident with Mark to the back of her mind. She couldn't afford to let it distract her, not when there was work to be done. But Mark, sitting at his table, had no such distraction. He took his phone out and checked his messages, reviewing some final details of the business deal he had just closed. He ignored the slight glance from the woman who had brought him his drink earlier. She seemed to be avoiding eye contact, but that didn't concern him. In fact, he felt justified in his irritation. He was used to the world catering to him, whether in business or in the small things like dining out. People should know their place, he thought. "Everything okay here, sir?" the manager asked, coming over to Mark's table. Mark waved his hand dismissively. "Everything's fine. But the waitress, she's incompetent," Mark muttered, continuing to scroll through his phone. "I pay for this meal, and it's nothing but trouble. She can't even bring me a proper drink without a smudge. Ridiculous." The manager, a tall, composed man, glanced at Sarah as she moved between tables, moving quickly and efficiently. He didn't say anything immediately, but he made a mental note of the exchange. He had been watching Mark for a while now, and though his customer was always demanding, this felt different. Meanwhile, Sarah stood in the back, eyes downcast, trying to focus on her duties. She could hear Mark's voice across the room, still complaining to the manager. He didn't know it, but this wasn't the first time his words had stung. Not for her. She'd been humiliated many times before, but something about this one felt more cutting, more personal. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about her place in the world, her worth being dismissed as insignificant. As the night wore on, Sarah's shift was drawing to a close. She found herself lost in thought as she prepared the final trays of drinks, ready to head out and pick up Timmy from daycare. Just as she was finishing up, a man approached the counter, and she looked up with a slight start. He was well-dressed, more casually than Mark, but still someone who clearly wasn't a regular at this restaurant. His eyes, a sharp and intense blue, met hers. "Excuse me," the man said, smiling warmly. "I couldn't help but overhear the exchange with that gentleman. I just wanted to say, you handled that situation with incredible composure." Most people would have snapped. Sarah smiled weakly, trying to muster some politeness despite her fatigue. "Thank you. It's just part of the job." The man chuckled softly. "It shouldn't be. People like him don't deserve to treat others like that." Sarah glanced toward Mark's table, and the man followed her gaze, then returned his focus on her. "Listen," he said after a pause. "I work in a different field, finance tech. I know people, influential people. If you ever need a connection or a different opportunity, I'll be happy to help. Just don't let someone like him make you feel small." Sarah blinked in surprise at the man's words, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not in moments like these. Her instinct was to brush it off, to downplay the situation as if it didn't matter. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady but guarded. "That's kind of you to say." The man smiled, extending his hand. "My name's David. I've seen people like him before, and I've also seen people like you strong, capable, and worth a lot more than they give you credit for." She hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Sarah," she replied simply. David slipped a business card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "If you ever need anything, a recommendation, a job lead, anything, just give me a call." Before Sarah could say anything more, David gave her a reassuring nod and left. She stared at the card for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't often that someone saw her beyond the uniform, beyond the role of a waitress. But she didn't dwell on it for long. She tucked the card into her pocket and returned to her work, determined to finish the night with her dignity intact. At Mark's table, the atmosphere was different. He had noticed the exchange between Sarah and David, though he hadn't heard the details. Still, something about it irked him. He wasn't used to being ignored or overlooked, and seeing someone take an interest in the waitress he had dismissed left a sour taste in his mouth. "Who was that?" he asked the manager as the man passed by. The manager, who had overheard parts of the conversation, shrugged. "Just another customer, sir." He seemed impressed with the service. Mark scoffed, his irritation growing. "Impressed? With her? Please. Some people have low standards." The manager didn't respond, but his expression tightened ever so slightly. Mark noticed and waved his hand dismissively. "Forget it. Just bring me the check." As Mark waited for the bill, he found himself scrolling through his phone again, trying to distract himself. But his thoughts kept circling back to the moment when David had approached Sarah. There was something about her composure, her quiet strength in the face of his outburst, that unsettled him. He had expected her to crumble, to apologize profusely, but instead, she had handled the situation with grace. It made him feel small. And Mark Whitmore was not a man who liked to feel small. The next morning, Mark arrived at his office in the heart of downtown. The gleaming skyscraper was a testament to his success, a physical manifestation of the empire he had built from the ground up. His assistant, Karen, greeted him as he stepped off the elevator. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. You have a meeting with the board at 10 and a lunch appointment with Mr. Davidson at 1. "Cancel Davidson," Mark said curtly. "He's always late." Karen nodded, used to his abruptness. "Understood. Anything else?" Mark shook his head and strode into his office, the glass walls giving him a panoramic view of the city. But even with all the power and prestige surrounding him, his thoughts kept drifting back to the restaurant, to Sarah. He told himself it was annoyance, that he was irritated by her supposed incompetence and the way she had garnered sympathy from someone like David. But deep down, a part of him wondered if he had overreacted. He pushed the thought aside and turned his attention to the day's tasks. Deals had to be closed, profits had to be made, and he didn't have time to dwell on insignificant moments. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for her shift at the restaurant, her mind still lingering on the events of the previous night. She had shown Timmy the business card David had given her, and her son's wide-eyed curiosity had made her laugh. "Are you going to call him, Mom?" Timmy asked, his voice filled with excitement. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah replied, ruffling his hair. "I'm not sure what I'd even say." "You could tell him you're the best waitress in the world," Timmy said matter-of-factly, making Sarah smile. "Maybe," she said, tucking the card into her purse. "We'll see." As she headed to work, Sarah resolved to keep her focus on the present. She had learned long ago not to put too much stock in what other people thought of her, whether it was Mark's disdain or David's kindness. Her priority was Timmy, and everything she did was for him. That evening, Mark found himself back at the restaurant, this time with a group of high-profile clients. He had chosen the venue for its exclusivity, confident that it would impress. But as he entered, his gaze swept the room, landing on Sarah as she carried a tray of drinks to another table. She didn't notice him at first, her attention focused on her work. But when their eyes met briefly, Mark felt an uncomfortable jolt. She didn't look at him with fear or anger, just a quiet, unshakable confidence that made him feel strangely exposed. The meal progressed smoothly at first, with Mark charming his clients and enjoying the fine cuisine. But as the evening wore on, his irritation began to bubble beneath the surface. Sarah's presence was a constant reminder of his outburst, and though she didn't approach his table, he couldn't help but feel her quiet dignity looming over him. At one point, one of his clients, a sharp-eyed woman named Elaine, leaned over and said, "You seem distracted, Mark. Everything all right?" "Of course," Mark replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about work." Elaine raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Still, her question lingered, making Mark feel even more on edge. Mark's discomfort grew as the evening progressed. Despite his attempts to focus on the conversation at his table, his attention kept drifting back to Sarah. She moved through the restaurant with an efficiency that seemed effortless, her composure unshaken even as she juggled demanding customers and tight schedules. It irritated him, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. By the time dessert was served, his patience was wearing thin. When Sarah finally approached his table to refill water glasses, Mark couldn't resist the urge to reassert control. "Careful this time," he said sharply as she poured water into his glass. "We wouldn't want another smudge incident, would we?" There was a flicker of something in Sarah's eyes, something quiet yet firm. But she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she simply replied, "Of course, sir," her tone neutral, before moving to the next guest. Mark expected her to look embarrassed or flustered, but she wasn't. Instead, she carried on as if his words hadn't touched her. It made him feel oddly powerless, and for a man like Mark, that feeling was intolerable. After dinner, Mark's clients praised the meal and the venue, commending him for his excellent choice. But as they left, Elaine lingered for a moment, her keen gaze fixed on him. "You were rather harsh with that waitress," she said, her tone casual but pointed. Mark stiffened. "She needs to learn to meet expectations." Elaine raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps. But it's worth considering who really exceeded expectations tonight." With that, she walked away, leaving Mark standing alone at the entrance. Her words echoed in his mind, stirring an unease he couldn't shake. Meanwhile, Sarah's shift finally ended. She sat in the staff lounge, rubbing her temples as the weight of the day settled over her. Her co-workers chatted quietly, decompressing from the night's chaos, but Sarah remained lost in thought. David's business card sat in her purse, a small but persistent reminder of the earlier encounter. She had brushed it off initially, assuming it was just a polite gesture, but now she found herself wondering, what if he really meant it? What if there was an opportunity waiting for her, one that could change everything? After a moment's hesitation, she pulled out the card and stared at it. The name and number seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, daring her to take a chance. Finally, with a deep breath, she took out her phone and dialed the number. "Hello." David's voice came through, warm and calm. "Hi, this is Sarah," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "From the restaurant?" "Sarah?" David exclaimed, sounding genuinely pleased. "I wasn't sure you'd call. How are you?" "I'm good," she replied, glancing around nervously. I wasn't sure if your offer was serious." "About helping me?" It absolutely was, David said firmly. I meant every word. Why don't we meet for coffee tomorrow? I'd love to hear more about your goals and see how I can help. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate this. As she ended the call, a small spark of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe this was the break she'd been waiting for. The next morning, Mark sat in his office, still stewing over Elaine's parting remark. It had struck a nerve, though he wouldn't admit it. He prided himself on being in control, on maintaining his reputation as a no-nonsense businessman. But something about the previous night had unsettled him. Karen knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. Mr. Whitmore, there's someone here to see you. Who is it? Mark asked, not bothering to look up. David Klein, Karen replied. He says it's urgent. Mark frowned. David Klein was a name he knew well, a prominent figure in the tech world with a reputation for making or breaking deals. Mark had tried to secure a partnership with him once before, but it hadn't panned out. Why would he be here now? Send him in, Mark said, straightening in his chair. David entered, his demeanor calm yet confident. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mark, he began, I wanted to talk to you about something, or rather to someone. Mark raised an eyebrow. Go on. Last night, I had the pleasure of meeting someone who works at the restaurant you frequent. A waitress named Sarah. Mark's expression hardened at the mention of her name. What about her? She's remarkable, David said, his tone unwavering. In a short conversation, she showed more resilience, intelligence, and potential than I see in most people. I've decided to invest in her future. Mark's jaw tightened. Invest? In what way? David leaned forward slightly. I offered her a position. It's a mentorship program I run for people with untapped potential. She'll get training, resources, and connections to help her achieve her goals. Mark forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. That's generous of you. It is, David agreed, his tone turning sharp. But I couldn't help noticing how you treated her. I've seen plenty of people like you, Mark, successful, powerful, but blind to the value of the people around them. Mark bristled. And what are you implying? I'm not implying anything, David said, standing. I'm stating a fact. People like Sarah are the backbone of this world. You do well to remember that. Mark sat frozen in his chair as David left, the sound of the office door closing behind him ringing in his ears. His jaw clenched, and he gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. How dare he come here, preaching about that waitress as if she were my equal? He couldn't shake the conversation. The thought of Sarah, a waitress, being singled out by someone as influential as David Klein felt like an insult to his ego. She wasn't supposed to matter, yet somehow she had managed to attract the attention of one of the most respected figures in the industry. For the rest of the day, Mark found it impossible to focus. Meetings blurred together, his usual sharpness dulled by the nagging feeling that he had underestimated someone, and that someone might be about to eclipse him in ways he couldn't predict. Sarah, on the other hand, felt a cautious sense of hope as she prepared for her coffee meeting with David. It wasn't just the opportunity he had offered that filled her with optimism. It was the validation she hadn't realized she needed. Someone had seen her value, not as a waitress but as a person, and it gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Timmy sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a workbook while Sarah adjusted her outfit, a simple blouse and slacks that she hoped struck the right balance between professional and approachable. Do you think he'll like you, Mom? Timmy asked, looking up from his drawing. Sarah smiled, crouching to his level. I hope so, sweetheart. But more importantly, I hope I can show him that I'm ready to work hard. You're the hardest worker I know, Timmy said matter-of-factly, making Sarah laugh and hug him tightly. At the cafe, David greeted Sarah warmly, his demeanor just as genuine as it had been at the restaurant. They talked about her background, her goals, and the challenges she'd faced as a single mother. David listened intently, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. You're incredibly resourceful, David said after she finished recounting her journey. That's exactly the kind of quality we look for in this program. It's not just about talent, it's about perseverance, and you've shown that in spades. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. I've always wanted to do more, but life, well, it doesn't always go as planned. David leaned forward, his tone encouraging. That's the thing about plans, they're flexible. What matters is that you're ready to take the next step, and I want to help you do that. As they talked through the details of the mentorship program, Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: confidence. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone with potential, someone worth investing in. News of Sarah's opportunities spread quickly within the restaurant. Her coworkers were a mix of supportive and envious, offering congratulations while speculating about what it meant for her future. Mark, meanwhile, couldn't ignore the chatter. Though he hadn't returned to the restaurant since his last encounter with Sarah, he heard enough from his network to know that David's mentorship program wasn't just talk. It was a serious commitment, one that could catapult Sarah into a completely different life. The idea unsettled him deeply. It wasn't just about Sarah. It was about control. Mark prided himself on being the kind of man who dictated the terms of every interaction, every relationship. But Sarah had slipped through his grasp, and now she was thriving in a way he hadn't anticipated. One evening, unable to resist his growing curiosity, Mark returned to the restaurant. He told himself it was just for dinner, just to remind himself that he still held sway over this space. But when he saw Sarah carrying trays with her usual quiet efficiency, something in him shifted. He watched her interact with customers, her demeanor calm yet confident. She wasn't the same person he had insulted weeks ago. There was a lightness in her step, a self-assuredness that hadn't been there before. And for the first time, Mark felt something he hadn't expected: shame. When Sarah approached his table to take his order, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll have the usual," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Of course," she replied, her tone professional but distant. There was no malice in her voice, but there was no warmth either. She treated him like any other customer, and it stung more than Mark cared to admit. As she walked away, Mark found himself replaying their previous interactions in his mind. He had dismissed her, insulted her, and treated her as though she were invisible. But she wasn't. She was someone who had risen above his scorn, someone who had captured the attention of people like David Klein. For the first time in years, Mark felt small. The next day, Mark did something he hadn't done in years. He took a hard look at himself. Sitting alone in his office, he pulled up articles about David's mentorship program and its participants. He read stories of people who had turned their lives around, built businesses, and created lasting change in their communities, all because someone had believed in them. And then he thought about Sarah. She had shown resilience and grace in the face of his cruelty. She hadn't fought back or lashed out. She had simply endured. And now she was rising above him, not because of luck, but because of her strength. Mark leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life building walls of power, wealth, and influence, that he hadn't realized how much they had isolated him. For the first time, he wondered if those walls had done more harm than good. Mark sat at his desk, his mind a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. For someone who had always prided himself on being unshakable, the past few weeks had been a humbling experience. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he had been wrong, not just about Sarah, but about how he treated people in general. He thought about David's words: "People like Sarah are the backbone of this world." Mark had always considered himself a self-made man, someone who had earned his place at the top. But now he wondered how much of that belief had been built on dismissing the contributions of others, especially those he deemed beneath him. With a sigh, Mark pulled out his phone and typed Sarah's name into the restaurant's employee directory. He hesitated for a moment before dialing the number listed under her profile. When the call connected, he heard her voice, calm and professional. "Hello, this is Sarah." "Hi, Sarah. It's Mark Whitmore," he said, his voice unusually subdued. There was a pause on the other end, and Mark could almost feel her surprise. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. "What can I do for you?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Apologies weren't something he gave often, and he found the words sticking in his throat. "I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you at the restaurant. It was uncalled for, and I was wrong." Another pause. When Sarah finally spoke, her tone was measured. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Whitmore. I appreciate it." Mark exhaled, relief washing over him. But he knew this wasn't enough. "If you're free, I'd like to meet and talk in person. I owe you more than just an apology." There was a long silence before Sarah replied, "I'll think about it. Let me know when and where." Mark thanked her and ended the call, feeling both anxious and hopeful. For the first time in years, he was stepping out of his comfort zone, not to close a deal or assert dominance, but to make amends. Sarah, meanwhile, was preparing for her next big step. With David's mentorship program in full swing, she had started attending workshops and networking events, meeting people from various industries who were eager to support her ambitions. It was a world she had never imagined being a part of, but she found herself thriving. During one workshop, a speaker encouraged participants to share their goals. When it was Sarah's turn, she stood up, her heart pounding. "My goal is to create a program that helps single parents like me balance work, education, and family life," she said. "I've been in their shoes, and I know how hard it is to juggle everything. I want to make it easier for others." The room erupted in applause, and David, who had been sitting in the back, gave her an approving nod. After the session, several attendees approached her, offering advice and resources to help bring her vision to life. For the first time, Sarah felt like she was in control of her future, and it was a feeling she never wanted to let go of. A week later, Mark and Sarah met at a quiet cafe. Mark arrived early, nervously checking his watch as he waited. When Sarah walked in, he stood, his usual confidence replaced by an unfamiliar nervousness. "Sarah," he said, offering a tentative smile. "Thank you for meeting me." She nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I was curious to hear what you had to say." Mark took a deep breath. "I won't waste your time. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I treated you, and not just you, but people like you. I've built my success on the backs of others, and I've never stopped to acknowledge that. Meeting you made me realize how blind I've been." Sarah listened silently, her expression unreadable. "I know I can't undo what I said," Mark continued, "but I want to do better. And if there's any way I can support you, your goals, your career, I'd like to try." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Why now, Mr. Whitmore? What's changed?" Mark hesitated. "Because I see now what I didn't see before. You're not just a waitress. You're resilient, intelligent, and driven. You deserve respect, not just from me, but from everyone." Sarah studied him, her gaze steady. "I appreciate your honesty, and I can see that you're trying. But respect isn't something you give once and move on. It's something you show every day." Mark nodded, humbled by her words. "You're absolutely right." They talked for a while longer, and though Sarah remained guarded, she began to see glimpses of sincerity in Mark's demeanor. For the first time, she wondered if change was truly possible for someone like him. As the weeks passed, Mark began to make small but significant changes. He implemented new policies at his company to ensure fair treatment of employees at all levels. He started volunteering at local community centers, using his resources to support initiatives like the one Sarah envisioned. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to thrive in David's program. With his guidance and the support of her growing network, she launched her pilot project for single parents, offering resources like childcare, job training, and financial planning workshops. The program was a success, and Sarah became a respected voice in her community. Their paths crossed again at an industry event where Sarah was a guest speaker. As she stood on stage, sharing her journey and the vision behind her program, Mark watched from the audience, his admiration for her growing with every word. When the event ended, Mark approached her, his expression warm but respectful. "You were incredible up there," he said. "What you're doing is inspiring." Sarah smiled, genuine warmth in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. And thank you for keeping your word." Mark nodded, his voice steady. "It's the least I can do." For the first time, they shook hands as equals, not as a wealthy man and a waitress, but as two people who had grown through the lessons life had taught them. As Sarah's program grew, so did her confidence. She was no longer the quiet, reserved waitress Mark had berated in a moment of arrogance. She was now a leader, someone who inspired others with her resilience and vision. Word about her initiative spread quickly, drawing attention from philanthropists and business leaders eager to support her work. At the same time, Mark's transformation continued to take shape. He started attending Sarah's workshops, not as a sponsor, but as a participant. For the first time, he listened to stories from people who had faced struggles he could barely comprehend. Single mothers balancing multiple jobs, fathers working night shifts to support their families, young people fighting for a second chance. All of it opened Mark's eyes to a world he had never truly seen. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Mark approached Sarah as she packed up materials from the workshop. "Sarah," he began, his tone sincere, "I wanted to thank you." She looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For letting me be part of this," he said. "Every time I come here, I learn something new, about the world, about myself. You've created something incredible." Sarah smiled, her expression softening. I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore. But the credit doesn't just go to me. It's the people here, their stories, their strength that make this work. Mark nodded, humbled once again by her words. Still, you gave them a platform. That matters. Months later, Sarah's program reached a new milestone, a partnership with a national nonprofit that provided funding to expand her initiative to other cities. The announcement was celebrated with a gala event, bringing together supporters, participants, and key figures from the community. Sarah was the guest of honor, and as she stood at the podium to deliver her speech, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Tonight isn't just about me, she began, her voice steady and clear. It's about every single person who has shown resilience in the face of adversity. It's about the power of community and the belief that everyone deserves a chance to thrive. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this journey, and I look forward to continuing this work together. The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she stepped away from the microphone. Mark, seated at a table near the stage, joined in the standing ovation. Watching Sarah's journey had been a humbling experience, but it had also been a source of hope. He saw in her the strength and determination he had spent years pretending he didn't need to respect. And now he was grateful for the lesson she had taught him. After the gala, Mark approached Sarah, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. For all his success and power, he still felt small in her presence. Not because she had diminished him, but because she had shown him the flaws in his own character. Sarah, he began, his voice soft. I wanted to say how proud I am of you. What you've accomplished, it's extraordinary. Sarah tilted her head, studying him. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. That means a lot. He hesitated, then added, and I wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance to change. Sarah's smile was warm but firm. You changed because you chose to, not because I gave you permission. That's what matters. Mark nodded, her words striking a chord deep within him. For the first time, he realized that change wasn't something others could grant. It was something that had to come from within. In the months that followed, Mark became one of Sarah's most dedicated supporters. He used his resources to help expand her program, connecting her with influential contacts and providing funding to ensure its long-term success. But he also made an effort to learn from her example, treating everyone he encountered with the respect and dignity they deserved. Sarah, in turn, continued to grow as a leader and advocate. Her program became a national model for empowering underserved communities, and she often spoke about the importance of resilience, compassion, and the belief in second chances. Years later, at another gala celebrating the expansion of Sarah's program to an international level, Mark watched from the audience as she delivered another moving speech. This time, he wasn't just a supporter, he was a friend, someone who had learned from her and grown because of her example. As the event wound down, Sarah joined Mark at his table, her expression one of quiet gratitude. You've come a long way, she said, raising her glass to him. Mark smiled, the lines on his face softened by years of humility and growth. So have you. They clinked glasses, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. A journey of redemption, resilience, and the transformative power of respect. Months turned into years, and Sarah's life continued to blossom in ways she had never imagined. Her program had grown from a small local initiative into a national network, offering support to thousands of families across the country. She had become a symbol of resilience and empowerment, her story inspiring countless others to rise above their circumstances. Mark, too, had undergone a profound transformation. The once arrogant businessman now approached life with a humility that surprised even himself. His contributions to Sarah's program went beyond financial support. He became an advocate for change, using his platform to highlight the importance of dignity and respect in all areas of life. But it wasn't just his public persona that had changed. Privately, Mark had begun to mend the fractured relationships in his own life. He reached out to old friends he had alienated with his ego, reconnected with estranged family members, and made a conscious effort to treat everyone he encountered with kindness. One sunny afternoon, Sarah and Mark met at a community event celebrating the opening of a new resource center funded by her program. The center was bustling with families, volunteers, and supporters, the air filled with laughter and a sense of possibility. As they stood together, watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Mark turned to Sarah, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, he said, his voice steady, meeting you changed my life. Sarah smiled, her eyes warm. I could say the same about you. You've come a long way, Mark. So have you, he replied, a hint of pride in his voice. But there's one thing I've always wanted to ask. What's that? Sarah asked, tilting her head. Do you think you'd be here? Do you think any of this would exist if I hadn't been such a jerk that night? His tone was light, but there was a genuine curiosity in his eyes. Sarah laughed softly, her gaze thoughtful. I think everything happens for a reason, she said. That night was awful, yes, but it was also a turning point for both of us. Sometimes, the hardest moments are what push us to grow. Mark nodded, her words resonating deeply. Well, I'm glad it did. And I'm grateful for you for the chance to be part of something meaningful. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sound of the celebration around them a reminder of how far they had come. For Sarah, this was a life she had fought for, a life she had earned. And for Mark, it was a testament to the power of redemption and the belief that change was always possible. As the event drew to a close, Sarah took the stage to deliver her closing remarks. The crowd fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady and filled with emotion. Today isn't just about opening a new center, she said. It's about opening doors for single parents, for families, for anyone who's ever felt like the odds were stacked against them. It's about showing the world that resilience, kindness, and community can overcome even the toughest challenges. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience. And it's about gratitude. Gratitude for the people who believed in this vision, who supported it, and who continue to make it possible. People like David Klein, who gave me my first chance. People like Mark Whitmore, who showed me that even the most unexpected allies can become friends. The audience erupted into applause, and Sarah stepped back from the microphone, her heart full. As she returned to her seat, Mark stood and offered her a quiet, genuine smile. You deserved every word, he said softly. Thank you, Sarah replied. For everything. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah and Mark walked through the nearly empty event space, the quiet settling around them like a comforting blanket. You've built something incredible, Mark said, his tone filled with admiration. Something that will last far beyond either of us. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's the goal, to leave the world a little better than we found it. And you have, Mark said. You've inspired so many people, including me. Sarah looked at him, her smile soft. And you've proven that change is possible. That's just as inspiring. They walked together in silence for a moment before parting ways, each carrying with them the lessons of their shared journey. For Sarah, it was a reminder of the strength that came from adversity. For Mark, it was a testament to the power of humility and the courage to grow. As they went their separate ways, the stars overhead seemed to shine a little brighter, a quiet promise of the impact they had made and the hope they had given to so many.